Hello, welcome to this lesson. The title of this lesson is Jean Luc Godard and his film Breathless. Jean Luc Godard is an icon of postmodern intellectual discourses which rely on his work to legitimize many key concepts and illustrate the departure of art from modernism. In a way, he is the only one living filmmaker to enjoy the status of a philosopher rather than a film director. This stalwart genius who vehemently interrogates the very idea of individual genius is now paradoxically a demigod for many experimental filmmakers across the globe. In other words, Godard is a filmmaker's filmmaker. Learning objectives: to enable the learner to understand the role of Godard in the evolution of contemporary cinema, to watch and analyze Breathless as a representative film of the French New Wave, to familiarize with the cultural, social, and political contexts of Godard's films, to provide the theoretical backdrop for appreciating experimental cinema. Jean Luc Godard was born in 1930 in Paris to wealthy parents of Franco-Swiss descent with aristocratic roots. The Protestant faith of his cosmopolitan family in a predominantly Catholic France and the elite circles around his mother and father, who was a physician, made his childhood privileged and distinct. His family moved to Nyon, a French bordering small town in Switzerland, when he was 4 years old, and Godard attended school there, living a life of high mobility and affluence. As he stated in an interview, at the age of 33, I quote, "There are Godards like there are foxes." His bondage to the family was so strong and strange simultaneously because he said it when he was estranged from the family. This ambivalence since childhood is formative in the artistic career of Godard because he was an aberrant child who defied the rules of nobility and stole the expensive books of his grandfather to sell it to the second-hand bookseller, not for money but for adventure. Such a childhood of rebellion against elitism permeates his work and so demands our understanding of the personal history of Godard, especially as he says, I quote, "I have a feeling that I am not asking for power or riches or anything, because I had more than plenty until I was 15, more than anyone. It was very different from Truffaut, for example," unquote. The affluent life around the Lake Léman, moving between France and Switzerland, was disturbed slightly in the World War II. But thanks to the Swiss neutrality, the Godards spent time at peace. In 1941, Godard entered the Collège de Nyon, which offered excellent education for the elite in classics, art, music, and science. Jean Luc was a noted skier at school, but played the fool occasionally where the male-female segregation existed in classrooms and in school dramas till 1945. In 1945, after the end of the war, Jean Luc entered Lycée Bouffon in Paris, leaving his parents, who were parting slowly and the subject of gossip till their divorce in 1952. His life as a student collided with his education in the cine clubs of the capital, but the family was unaware of his passion when they heard about his failure in exams and saw him as a black sheep. In 1948, he returned to Switzerland after failing in the baccalaureate. Next year, he went to Paris and joined a boarding school for retest and passed the exam. He estranged himself from the world of formal language and etiquette in the family and caricatured the family members for their bourgeois hypocrisy in his self-made books. Cinema was not yet his chosen art. He painted a lot, and his mother organized an exhibition of his painting in 1949. The same year, he registered at Sorbonne for a certificate in anthropology but did not attend classes, and luckily, he could understand the intellectual trend of the time by his exposure to structural anthropology. Jean Rouch began his series of African anthropological films at the time, and Godard frequented the film circles and visited Cinétech, a museum-like facility founded by Henry Langlois and Gregis Franjou in 1936 for housing and screening films. That was like a school for young Godard. 1950 is an important year in the life of Godard because his father closed his clinic and went to the USA with the children, where Jean Luc started a long journey to South America that had a big impact on his mind. But his parents arranged him a job in a Swiss construction company, and thereafter he joined Swiss television service in Zurich, where he was jailed for theft from his own employers. His father got him out of jail and persuaded him to go to a mental hospital specializing in psychotherapy. This episode created a serious, maybe the final break with the family, and after returning from the hospital, he joined the construction company again and saved his wages for his first film, a documentary on the construction of the dam at La Grande Dixins, entitled Operation Beaten or Operation Concrete.
En aval de l'ancien, bientôt enseveli dans les... Mais elle est aveugle. C'est un téléphoniste qui dirige la manœuvre et donne au conducteur du Blondin, assis dans sa...
In the meanwhile, Godard, with Maurice Scherer, a literature teacher and a writer, took the pseudonym Eric Romer, for his mother would have been shocked for his connection with cinema, and Rivet founded the short-lived film journal La Gazette du Cinéma, the Gazette of Cinema, which saw publication of 5 issues in 1950. He wrote short but powerful articles on films under the pseudonym Hans Lucas in this journal. It was a time when film was looked upon as a medium and rejected by the champions of high culture, and the journal struggled for the status of cinema as a great art form. For this goal, the journal published a short text by Paul Valéry and a long lecture by Jean-Paul Sartre, Why the Cinema is Not a Bad School. Godard wrote in every issue about films like Jean Genet's masterpiece, The Song of Love, to Hollywood classics. In his writings, the influence of André Bazin liked each word and an ideology of film as a revolutionary art underscores. When Bazin and his friends founded the journal Cahiers du Cinéma in 1951, Godard became a young film critic, contributing reviews and articles regularly. Godard made a short film, A Flirtatious Woman, in 1995 in Geneva. Richard Body says, I quote, his 3 short films of 1957 to 1958 are not cinema, but a substitute for cinema. In effect, they are conceptual gags that allowed Godard to exercise his powers of verbal invention. Unquote. When Claude Chabrol left his job in the publicity department of Fox Film Production Company, he invited Godard to receive the post. This was a turning point in the life of Godard and his friends. Chabrol had begun his Les Cousins, The Cousins. Truffaut was preparing for the 400 Blows, and Rivet was busy working for Paris Belongs to Us. Godard tried all means for making his own film. That was the beginning of a new generation of filmmakers known later as the French New Wave, who emerged dramatically out of their hard labor and persistence for a cinema of anti-capitalist politics that might deny the semioticity of the genre, which director as the auteur or author. Pierre Braunberger produced a short film All the boys are named Patrick, directed by Godard. Another short, Charlotte and her boyfriend, followed this. In 1959, all his career friends were in Cannes Festival. An indigent Godard in Paris desperately sought money and borrowed from the till of the journal for making his journey to Cannes. There he met Truffaut and Chabrol and started working on a story once discussed with them called Breathless, which later became the first feature directed by Jean Luc Godard. George D. Beauregard financed and made possible the long-deferred dream of Godard. Breathless became one of the great milestones in the history of cinema. It was the beginning of an extraordinary, prolific career followed by success after success. For the sake of study, we can divide the films of Godard into 4 periods. New Wave period, 1960 to 1967, Revolutionary years 1968 to 1979, Cycle of video experimentation 1975 onward, recent contemplative period since 1980s, New Wave period 1960 to 1967, comprising Breathless 1960, The Little Soldier 1961, My Life to Live 1962, The Carabiniers and Contempt 1963, Band of Outsiders 1964, A Married Woman 1964, and The Chinese 1967 as the culmination of his political statement through the medium, followed by a more sensational and abstract Weekend 1967, in which Karl Marx was famously placed with Jesus Christ. Breathless is the most celebrated film from this period, and we can discuss more about it later. The Chinese must be considered as a departure from the obviously interior world of individuals that was explored since Breathless for a direct focus on politics. The familiar world of relationships and conflicts within individuals evolved into a chaotic reality of social unrest and political uncertainty through these films. In other words, Godard started from the ABC of bourgeois film sensibility and denounced it completely for an inconvenient depiction of truth following the anti-war movement in the time of American invasion of Vietnam and the Marxist aesthetics of the time. Revolutionary years 1968 to 1979. Godard's movies like The Joy of Learning 1968, Film Like Any Other 1968, British Sounds 1969, Wind from the East 1970, Struggle in Italy 1971, Everything is Well 1972, Here and Elsewhere 1974, Number 2 1975 belong to the revolutionary years phase. Among these films, The Joy of Learning is an instance of Godard's philosophy of making political films politically. He began the shooting of the film before the events of 1968 and finished it just after the end. Referring to Friedrich Nietzsche's Gay Science, Joyful Wisdom, 1882, this film discusses the existential angst of modern world and travels beyond the limits of cinematic realism for a deeper philosophical debate with the viewers. The director engages the spectators in an intimate conversation, leaving behind the story of Patricia and Emily. Cycle of video experimentation 1975 onward, From number 2 in 1975, Godard experiments with video as a tool that produced a number of works like Every Man for Himself, 1980, Passion, 1982, and others. History of Cinema, 1980-1998, a monumental work that took almost 2 decades to finish, is the most important work among them. It's an overarching essay on the history of images, sounds, music, art, and literature. Collages and superimpositions portray ideas and impressions with documentary style comments and interviews in this experimental series. The advent of video art, video installations, and digital art could transform the very concepts of video in recent times, and Godard might be a significant contributor. A recent contemplative period since 1980s to the present work of Godard takes a more contemplative turn, crossing the aesthetics of his own explicit political style. He is speaking both philosophy and politics in a more subtle and self-reflexive fashion. David Sterrett called it a subjunctive cinema, I quote, in which every important gesture, each image, sound, cut, superimposition, and so on is less a link in an expository chain, unquote. Instead of conveying something, everything is in a process in these films that question and revise both the films and the filmmaker. Hail Mary 1985, New Wave 1919, Forever Mozart 1996, Film Socialism 2010, 3 into 3D 2013, Goodbye Language 2014, and The Image Book 2018 are the best examples to grasp the dialogue Godard started with himself and later with his fans. His exhaustive passion to divulge the complex depth of human mind in a more complex cinematic language and the exhibition of his mastery over the medium might distract even his admirers from these recent adventures. But Godard goes on without a halt even at the age of 88. By itemizing Godard's oeuvre so neatly, we may miss the unconventional trajectory of his career that resisted all categorization in all possible means. This includes his many shorts, docufictions, and documentaries, not to mention yet to be named experiment with filmmaking. Formalistic look at his works reveals them in a collision between realism and formalism in 1960 to 1968, as in films such as Breathless, and a phase of making political films politically with Jean-Pierre Gorin and Dziga Vertov Group, a collective of far-left artists in 1968 to 1975, and a mystical turn since 1978 for a more personal cinema. The more experimental ways of looking at himself developed by Godard are attempts to write his own biography with others' words. Breathless, 1960. Godard's Breathless appeared in a time of drastic changes in sensibility throughout the world. As historian Erich Hobsbawm stated, the 1960s was the decade of cultural revolution across the world, leaving behind the bitter experience of World War II. Culture, rather than economy or politics per se, took the center stage of debates across the world. This cultural turn gave birth to Beat Generation in the USA, New Wave in French cinema, rhythm and blues and soul in music, and witnessed the emergence of Third World in political ideology. In the domain of philosophy, existentialism achieved almost the status of a religion or a way of life, as Jean-Paul Sartre as the high priest and prophet. All these points are important in understanding the movie Breathless and its director Godard, because these are not mere undercurrents but the substance for both. Originally titled as Above the Souffle, meaning the end of breath or being winded, traveled to English-speaking countries as Breathless. Even after 6 decades of its release, Breathless is the most widely known and frequently seen work of Godard. In terms of cinematic syntax, the jump cuts, character asides, breaking the eye-line match in continuity editing, and characters addressing the audience with thoughts, feelings, and instructions, Breathless ruthlessly shattered the realist notions. But it could create a large group of fanatic fans everywhere, and as Michelangelo Antonioni said, it divided cinema history into pre-Godard and post-Godard. The plot of Breathless is based on a scenario by Truffaut. Richard Brody says, I quote, his original plan had been to use Truffaut's story outline and merely add dialogue to it. Instead, he remodeled the entire story, reconfiguring the action, adding and subtracting characters, and drastically shifting the emphasis. Unquote. Breathless opens by showing the front page of Paris Flirt, a newspaper, on it, and the ad image of a girl in skimpy dress holding a doll who resembles the heroine, and the words, I quote, so I am a son of a bitch. After all, it's got to be done. It has to. Obviously spoken by the decadent existentialist hero, a white machismo with a large cigar in his mouth. His name is Michel Poicard. Jean-Paul Belmondo, a rascally Parisian who loves France and living on stealing cars, a seducer rogue with lots of connections but few friends. David Sturridge continues, I quote, looking directly toward the camera, he surveys the scene around him and lifts his hand to his mouth, rubbing his thumbs across his lips in a nervous back and forth motion. Later, we will learn that this thumb to lips gesture is borrowed from the tough guy persona often adopted by Hollywood star Humphrey Bogart. Unquote. Michel's self is the product of cinema, at least in terms of his movements and gestures. This cultural kleptomania is revealed when we realize that he is a Bogart fan. The cinephiles and the fandom everywhere consciously or unconsciously model their lives on cinematic characters and images, and this process makes cinema a social force. In the following scene, Michel steals a car with the help of a woman and starts his flight from the scene without giving any attention to the woman. This disregard to fellow creatures is the essential part of his loner existence that turns into a disregard to his own self and life in the end. When a police officer on motorcycle chases him for overspeed, Michel shoots him and flees on foot into the open fields of the countryside. In the following scenes, we see him meeting Patricia, who sells newspaper but wants to be a writer for the New York Herald Tribune that she sells. When he persuades her to come with him for Italy, she is in confusion and Michel sees another woman and steals money from her. Next, he tries in vain to find an underworld guy who owes him money. Then he visits Patricia in her place and sneaks into her room like a peeping Tom. Following is a 26-minute sequence that takes place in the room, mostly showing Michel and Patricia in their own world of making love, teasing, sleeping, waking up, and talking about love, life, and other things. When Patricia reveals that she is pregnant, Michel receives it with cold heart, and the same numbness continues in the face of the blaring headlines announcing he is wanted for murder. First, Patricia helps him hide from the police, but she turns him in when the detectives hint at her deportation and criminal charges. This takes place in very familiar film noir surroundings in a friend's studio where they found a new hideout. Patricia calls the police when Michel goes out for buying food but warns him afterwards, probably out of love or guilt. Again, the chasing starts. The heart-throbbing speed of the action and camera verite sequences making his fleeing live. But he is shot in the back and dies in the street, closing his eyes with his own hand under Patricia's blank gaze. The above given gist of the action illustrates best Godard's own often quoted critique of Hollywood, citing Griffith, that goes like, I quote, "All you need to make a movie is a girl and a gun," unquote. The fact of the matter about Breathless is quite contrary to this storyline. Raoul Cotillard's supple cinematography using a handheld Arriflex camera and the score by Martial Solal that cites from Mozart, Bach, etc. and the visual quotes from Bergman, Samuel Fuller, Fritz Lang, along with allusions to William Faulkner, Dylan Thomas, Rilke, Maurice Chasles, use of paintings by Auguste Renoir, Paul Klee, makes something extraordinary in the history of cinema. Right from the unusual dedication, that is to Monogram Pictures, a production company, Godard begins his play with the medium. Elliptical editing, that is cutting the time of action from real time and making shorter sequences. Jump cuts in which two sequential shots of the same object or subject are taken from camera positions that vary only slightly, creating the feeling of a jump in time. And the self-reflexive cameo appearance of Godard and another French director, Jean-Pierre Melville, as a writer are some of the frequently exploited points. Long shots such as Michel and Patricia strolling on the boulevard and two short sequences like Killing of the Cop collate to form a visual experience of unsettling or coherent perception. Jean Seberg's acting that invited criticism from many reviewers was the advent of a new melancholic style. I quote, "Godard appears to be entranced with Seberg as Michel is with the character he plays," writes David Sterritt, unquote. Concerning the script, later Godard said, "I wrote the scenes while having breakfast at the Dupont Montparnasse, or there was no script before the shoot." This idiosyncratic scripting produced a particular on-screen results. Godard's spontaneous method deliberately frustrated the actors' attempt to compose their characters in any naturalistic or psychologically motivated way. In effect, Godard's actors were quoting Godard. Rather than becoming their characters, they were imitating them, said Brody. Instead of directorial instructions on acting, he asked his characters to enter a cafe or a phone booth and exit without paying, etc., for a more spontaneous acting. In other words, the actors imitated characters, not living them or identifying with them. Similarly, the locations in Paris remain intact in the film. Even though the expression is a cliché now, Paris is a character in the film and Godard conceived it that way. The concept of flaneur, the bondage between characters and urban spaces as consumers of the built environment, is visible throughout the film. When we watch Michel use the freshly brought newspaper for shining his shoes, we realize the extent of American consumerism that conquered French culture of the time and the trashing of print modernity of Europe. Breathless is not just a movie that changed the French film of the time. Its echoes reverberated world cinema for many decades, and even today it attracts film enthusiasts. By exhibiting the seamy side of film as a medium, it started a new language for self-reflexivity. In line with the new wave cinema's idea of cinema as a phenomenon of intelligence, Breathless kept an array of allusions, citations, quotes beyond the obvious. I quote, become immortal and then dies, unquote, is the wish of Patricia. This film remains immortal and unwilling to die. Thank you for watching the video.